Thank you, John. Our keynote speaker for today is Dr. Charles Massy. I'm very proud to have him as the keynote speaker because he's a semi-neighbour of mine. I live in Cooma and he lives south of Cooma at Severn Park. Charlie has that wonderful combination of being a farmer and an academic, and he's written a wonderful book called Call of the Reed Warbler. And before I go any further about books, a number of our speakers have written books, and Harry Hartog Bookshop is selling them in both lunch hours. And hopefully some of the speakers will be able to sign books if you want to buy them. So I now ask Charlie, we're running slightly over time, so I think probably we will be limiting, we won't have any question and answer. I'll have to let Charlie take the whole of the 50 minutes remaining before morning tea. But would you welcome Dr. Charles Massy?
Thank you, Jenny and John and Shane and previous speakers, and welcome everyone. I think the only place we can start is the greatest crisis that's ever confronted our species, the fact that we have now moved into a new epoch called the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch created by we humans. What's ironic is that it was life itself that created conditions for life on this planet. When the first bacteria evolved, in a way, the whole process went. But now, this blue-green planet is under threat from just one species, which is us. And has just been alluded to by John. We know some of the signs of an increasing Anthropocene behaviour. And as I said at the start, I don't think there's any doubt that this is the greatest crisis that our species has ever confronted in its history. And it puts me in mind of a famous lithograph by Dürer in the 15th century about the four horsemen from the apocalypse. It's actually so hard to grasp, which is why the politicians can't move, that we have this pending catastrophe beyond our imaginings. And as I'm sure some of our great climate scientists and planetary scientists, Stefan and others will touch on later, what's behind this shift into the Anthropocene is what they call the Great Acceleration, whether it's in socio-economic trends, Earth system trends, post-Second World War, all showing an exponential graph. And as I'll show later, in delayed fashion, that also applies to the human health crisis. And in reality, endless growth is the philosophy of a cancer cell. And so that's the key driver. We tell ourselves as a modern civilization, this growth for the sake of growth. And as the wonderful, passionist, earth-focused philosopher Thomas Berry said, a desolate outer world immediately produces a desolate inner world. And so the pathology, as I said, of the modern world is our inability to relate to the natural world. And I'm put in mind at the current moment of the appeasers, Chamberlain, Balfour, etc., through the 30s. And only one voice was standing out, and that was Winston Churchill, pretty much. And there are parallels to what we're seeing in Ukraine, etc., today, but I won't go into that. But Churchill's definition of an appeaser was he who feeds the crocodile, hoping he'll be the last to be eaten. And if you think about the Anthropocene, that's pretty much sums up the dithering of our politicians. So as I know we'll hear later from our leading planetary scientists, our precious blue-green Earth is sustained by 9 planetary boundaries. But I've put a blue cross against those that are being affected detrimentally by industrial agriculture. Climate change is obvious, the amount of carbon dioxide we release, and therefore being absorbed in the oceans creates increased ocean acidification, destabilizing the phosphorus, integrated phosphorus-nitrogen cycle, massive overuse of global fresh water, horrendous changes in land use, and biodiversity loss. We now know that our Earth is now in the midst of the 6th greatest extinction event in the history of the planet. This time, not due to geological and other events, but what our species is doing to that biodiversity. So that's the bleak side. I'm optimistic. I think there's grounds for hope, because if industrial agriculture is a major causal factor in this destabilisation of the planet, then a regenerative agriculture can be a key solution. So first, I think we need to consider, how do we get into the crisis? And you'll notice I've put a hyphen between agri and culture, because as one farmer said, the problem's the square foot of real estate between our ears. What we know is our Western agriculture evolved from 10 to 12,000 years ago in that eastern part of the Mediterranean that we call the Fertile Crescent. It was literally a Garden of Eden. So there were long co-evolved grasslands with ruminants in them that were settled, rich river valleys. Most of the Mediterranean was forested. And amongst those grasslands were these little weedy plants that today we call the modern cereal species, which co-evolved to being grazed by ruminants, by the way. That's the Fertile Crescent today. It's been desertified. And with it goes constant social conflict. So the point I'm making is we are a powerful species. And that's no Garden of Eden anymore. And as President Roosevelt said in the midst of the Great Depression, a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. And we now know that globally, agriculture degraded over 37% of all land suitable for agriculture. And we're continuing to do it in Australia. The minute we overclear, overgraze, crop poison, putting carbon in the atmosphere, we're on the steps to creating deserts, to desertification. We had our own dust bowls. I remember as a young climber in New Zealand in the early 70s climbing on red ice, and an aggressive Kiwi said, "Yes, that's your bloody Mallee droughts." And then millions of tonnes of dust covered those thousands of kilometres to New Zealand, and that's occurred regularly since. Precious topsoil. Leading agrarian thinker in the States, Wes Jackson, says that the ploughshare may well have destroyed more options for future generations than the sword. I think he's right. And it's not just in the past. Every time we get a major drought, with increasing ground cover gone in cropping and overgrazing, ferals and all the rest of it, the dust storms keep coming, a precious topsoil. So again, that's the negative. There's a lot of positives, and there is another pathway. And I see Regen Ag as a key pathway to addressing the Anthropocene. So it sounds simple. Healthy landscapes and soils will deliver healthy food and fibre, healthy profits, people, and a healthy planet. And I've moved to a complex adaptive systems view of regenerative agriculture now, from what I've observed over the last few decades. It comprises those agricultural practices that enable landscapes and systems to self-organise back to open-ended health. In other words, to self-heal, utilising the emergent properties that reside within the system, those long co-evolved systems. It's very much a complex adaptive systems view. And if we're going to turn things around, we have to become literate again and gain ecological literacy, understand how our landscapes function, which I never did as a beginning farmer. And that's picture on the left is actually, what was actually in 2011, an A3 page in all the major rural weeklies in Australia. Land, Stock and Land, Queensland Country Life, the Western Australian papers. It's an advertisement for Roundup, glyphosate. So the earth's there to be attacked, sexy smiling face on the Roundup drum, and embedded in that small print are lines like, trust your killer instincts. So here we're being told the story by the big multinationals that we've got to simplify, dominate, if necessary, kill this enemy of nature. And we now know that the costs are huge and mounting, and especially also for human health. And it's further separating us from the very landscapes that we evolved in. And that's where our landscape illiteracy continues to come from. And I speak with authority because I've been there. I had to take over a farm when I was 22. I knew nothing about management. So I asked the best managers in the district, which was industrial. We walked into a 5-year drought. And I thought my most important capital asset was my livestock genetics, my precious sheep. And the land was just a substrate. And I still grieve when I look at that photo. And that was all due to the paradigm I carried, which made me blind to the elements of ecological literacy. But there is another way to farm. And the best things in life are indeed free. And of course, I'm starting with sunlight. Not fossil fuels, but actual sunlight that leads to photosynthesis and sugars going into the soil. Of course, fossil fuels come from that originally. So in teaching to university students, I've sort of adapted a landscape functional model to help an understanding of how things work. Alan Savey and others have focused on 1 to 4, and I've added number 5, that weird species on the right. So without going through 101 agronomy, etc., but clearly everything starts with sun, photosynthesis, which directly impacts the water cycle, directly impacts the soil mineral cycle, and also biodiversity or dynamic ecosystem communities. And then there's us, our species, human social. What's important here are those interconnected arrows. They go every which way, returning both ways. And they're operating indivisibly and dynamically in feedbacks. And it's these that actually undergird all ecosystems and indeed our own civilization. As I said, that's where fossil fuels have come from. What happens when we do that? Bare the soil, destroy the biology, overgraze, crop poison. All those interconnected, indivisible, dynamic feedbacks are destroyed. And so I just want to give you some positive examples of when, for reasons of delineation, we focus on the weakest element in the system out of those 5 key landscape functions. So, as I said, I needn't go through 101, solar energy. No, green plants are the foundation of the whole process, increasing energy flow and capture. And our role as regenerative farmers is to increase that primary trophic base. So I see my role as a manager with a crop or grazer, which I'll come to later, is to stack on for as long as I can throughout the year as many of those solar panels, the chloroplasts, to keep pulling those sugars in and punching them into the soil. It's as simple as that. And it's this function that, as I said, impacts all the other cycles. Probably the most hectares, are in the tens of millions now in 5 continents across the world, is the ruminant grazing systems originally evolved by Alan Savey in what was Rhodesia. As a wildlife ranger in the 60s, he noticed the vast animal herds on the left there. And he asked the question, how come you can have millions of animals as they did then, and yet they're the healthiest grasslands on earth? And And he worked out that there's intense animal density, dunging and urine, but they weren't there very long because the big cat predators were moving them. It's only there for a few days and probably didn't come back for 6 months. And bottom right, the similar situation applied before humans arrived in North America, maybe 60, 80 million bison. But the principle that evolved out of that was high animal density, which we can adapt to our farms through fencing, etc. Short grazings and long rest periods. And modifications around that leads to extraordinary regeneration within your landscapes. Bearing in mind that most landscapes, including a lot of our cereal crops, are co-evolved for ruminant grazing. And so I was privileged with my wife Fiona to stay with the late Norman Kroon in the Karoo region in South Africa. And when he moved there in the 70s, and that farm on the right, still like that now, he had to walk 1 kilometre to find a perennial plant. There was 200 years of bashing by Dutch and English settlers. And he implemented, one of the first to implement holistic grazing. You can see his country on the left. He's getting remarkable results within 3 years. And I'm talking about semi-arid country, 8 to 12 inch rainfall. And you can see the diversity and the soft ground, etc. And the farms he's got now more than tripled his production on the original starting base. I could give you lots of these comparative slides, but this is similar climate in the Upper Pilbara, Western Australia. Probably set stocked and flogged by sheep and cattle from the 1870s and 80s. And that farm on the left is typical. Those boards are a Department of Agriculture officer doing a study there, Tim Wiley. So that farm on the left, typical of the set stocking, well less than 10% ground cover. Then this family bought a farm adjoining called Sheila Plains. Again, stocked it with cattle, but a holistic manner. Then now running between 3 and 5 times more cattle. And the ground cover is well over 90%. It's quite transformative when you work on those 4 key landscape functions. And of course, if you're going to be a good livestock manager, it's important to be in touch with your environment and be observant about what you're doing, unlike these guys. What's important is, because of what I was saying about the co-evolution of a lot of our cropping plants with ruminants, the same principles apply to a lot of the new cropping. The pasture-cropping, multi-species cover, etc., which employ ruminants as a necessary part in the system. So grazing and cropping are combined and managed in a way where each one is benefiting the other, as they co-evolve to do. So that's a quick illustration of the solar cycle. Of course, that directly impacts the water cycle because the solar cycle is putting a lot of carbon in the soil, changing the biology and allowing for that water storage capacity. This is an actual savoury client in tough country in Mexico. Those 2 blue arrows are the same point in that landscape, just 27 years apart. So on the left, probably 200 years of overgrazing, set stocking, denudation of vegetation, compaction, get a big rain, it all ends up at the bottom. Then the shift to regen grazing, and you can see the same place in that landscape. No water visible, but probably 10,000 times more in ground. And a lot greater carrying, a lot greater resilience to droughts and all that sort of thing. This is close to home on my own country, the Monero. It was 2 years ago at the end of that 3-4 year drought. On the left, you've got just before the drought broke in June. And the owner on the left clearly didn't like grass. He set stock that, and every time there's a wind, the topsoil moved over at least 2-3 years. Property on the right was sensitively destocking to the declining rainfall, either adjusting or selling. And the next month, the drought broke. We knew it was coming, about 100 mils, and I went for a drive at the 10 mil mark, only 10 mil. And that country on the left could not absorb any more water after just 10 mils. It was pouring mud and crap, filling up the dams. Paddocks on the right, the other neighbour, no water visible, it all went in. When the rain finished and 24 hours later, I went for a drive. The country on the left was still doing that, still pouring out water. Couldn't absorb any more. On the right, still no visible sign of water. So the farmer on the right absorbed about 100% of that drought breaker. The guy on the left absorbed 15 to 10% of the drought breaker. All because of these landscape fundamentals. And I speak with authority because I've been there. So what we're talking about here is the small water cycle, which is our source of about 2/3 of water on land. And we'll have real experts on this like Walter Yainer talking later about water cycles, I think, etc. But in our sort of country, grasslands and woodlands, we had a high percentage of the summer active C4 grasses and forbs with their associated mycorrhizal fungi and the little marsupials that have all disappeared, but they love fungi and they spread the spores. And the ground was soft and absorbent. And there's this huge interaction between above ground air and the soil atmosphere. For example, at night, for at least half the year, you probably have about a foot of moist air at night at 99% relative humidity covering the land. Sun comes up in the morning, pressure reverses, and you're absorbing in that country about 3 millimetres of rain, probably per night for half the year. That's 12, 15 inches of bonus rain that we don't get now. Sort of no-brainer stuff. But if we overgraze, overclear, overburn, and I'm glad Shane was here because I work with it in Garago Elder, and we know traditional burning has a huge role to play in changing carbon and depends on what vegetation you use, etc. So I'm not criticising burning, it's overburning, but also the wrong cropping, we will destroy the small water cycle, as those Monero photos revealed before. This is a classic case in Western Australia, in the bunny fence, when they decided, the Western Australian government after the Second World War decided to allow clearing of the mallee. Now that photo on the right, that dark vegetation that was left, it was the low rainfall country, well below 12 inches of rain. They then cleared all that land, and we now have this conundrum that what was once high rainfall is now lower rainfall by 2 or 3 inches, immediately west of that boundary. And you can see clouds gathering over the native vegetation. So what this is really illustrating is the importance of rain-making bacteria that come from our plants. The small water cycle depends on these plant microbes that act as nuclei around which the water droplets and ice crystals form. And these bacteria contain proteins that allow ice formation. And some of the evidence out of the States shows that one bacteria can be the source of 1,000 ice crystals. And cloud water contains unbelievable amounts of different species of bacteria. One piece of research up to 28,000. But if you, and I'll put a penetrometer into soils across different parts of Australia. And on the left, if you look at the modern tillage soils, initially starting with plough and now the spraying and even the different types of modern tillage, you still have these compaction layers. You can often go through 2 or 3. Very little root penetration, what's called biopores for the water to penetrate, compared to a non-tilled, well-managed grazing or a regenerative tilled field on the right, where you get much greater root penetration, much greater water storage, much more carbon, etc., and a lot more biology. And in 2011, I cut across on a research trip the very top, it was a back road on the top of the Liverpool Plains, arguably some of Australia's richest, best soil. It was a dry season and they'd had an 8 mil rain event the night before. I came through, next morning, here's water lying on Australia's best soils. So behind the railway line, I hopped over the fence, had a look at those soils. They were completely dead, thick crusts, no life, no structure, and they could not absorb an 8 mil rain event. There's no carbon in the soil to aid that process. So I guess my key message is we can't go back, but through regenerative grazing and cropping, we can help restore the small water cycle and regenerate our landscape functions. And I guess the secret of it all, if you get the solar cycle and the small water cycle right, is this valuable soil mineral cycle, something I was ignorant about, the importance of the soil biology. It's all about having a biologically active living soil. So we know that soil microbes and other soil life require plants for food. Mycorrhizal fungi releasing sugars, etc., that feeds the plants. We know that the natural world is composed of these independent communities of organisms. But 93% of these organisms are microbes. We can't see the little buggers, which is why I was ignorant of them, unless you find the odd worm or something. And so the process, if you get it right, is the plants release the root exudates and decaying plant organic matter, which feeds the soil biology. And in return, it's that life that supplies nutrients to plants. Like fungi have this wonderful symbiosis. They receive plant sugars, their role is to go off and source all the micronutrients, nutrients, etc., for the plants. So it's simple as that, while carbon is being fixed. So put very simply, soil is a community, not a bloody commodity. And there's an extraordinary example of this couple in Western Australia called Ian and Di Haggerty, who've evolved an entirely new form of agriculture and cropping called natural intelligence agriculture. And they will yield crops on 6 to 14 inches of rain regularly. And any of us went over there, you'd laugh at the country they're cropping in, 4 hours northeast of Perth. It's essentially glorified beach sand. But integral to their system is ruminant animals. And so what they've done, they've dispensed with all industrial inputs. Profitability's gone through the roof, eliminated 90% of their costs. And at the point of sowing their seeds, whether cereal or canola, they're injecting worm juice, the biology, and at the same time, compost extract, sourced by one of the members here, from one of the members here in this audience, which is the food for the biology. And they've now evolved this extraordinary process of cropping, getting equivalent yields or better, much greater resistance to frost and rain damage at critical times before harvest because of the integrity of those plants. So this is a photo of a comparison between a traditional country on the left, that photo on the left, and I remember visiting ram clients in November. They'd harvest, fill the silos full of seed, full of grain, feed out the stock on the beach sand, and it looked like that photo top right. But today, with modern chemicals, anything green, is evil weeds that might be putting carbon in, they're sprayed out as well. What's happened to the Haggerty's paddock, because of the grazing and the good timings, is that we're now seeing the emergence of C4, C3 grasses that haven't been seen for a while. And so they move into a summer with feed after the harvest, as well as carbon ongoing into the soil. So when these soils, the neighbour's paddock was put, the traditional neighbour was put under a microscope, you can see there's hardly any biology, mycorrhizal fungi there, very low soil aggregation, hardly any fungal hyphae, etc. 40 metres across the fence, that's the Haggerty soil. You can't see any roots. It's covered in biology, the hyphae from the fungi and the important glomalin, a complex carbon compound that can squirrel away long-term carbon. And that's what healthy soils look like, these sticky networks. And Walter Yaner, who's going to talk later, has this wonderful metaphor that our soils should be like cathedrals. The cathedral stones are the mineral particles, and the cement's the soil organic matter. And healthy aggregated soils up to 50% or more air, and a lot's going on there. Water storage, nutrient exchange, disease protection, There's a huge surface area for those important cations, essential minerals, etc. It's like whacking them onto Velcro. In other words, healthy soil has intelligent selective interfaces, hence the Haggerty's term of natural intelligence agriculture. But if we farm like those pictures on the right, it's no different to what happened to those great cathedrals in the Second World War in Europe. We're collapsing the structure on. And there's other modern cropping techniques now evolving, multi-species pasture cropping, where animals are an essential part of the cropping cycle. And without going into the detail, it's about replicating nature's diversity, at least 15, 20, 25 species across the 5 plant genera. If you manage it well, as a photo on the right, time your grazings, you can also harvest the cereal at the end of it. And then you've got for the summer, fodder for your stock and a bit more carbon going in, depending on the summer, but certainly ground cover. One of the pioneers of this in the States, who's worked with people like Colin Sykes in Australia, is Gabe Brown. And he uses his animals, he's in North Dakota, uses his animals to lay down that cover at the end of grazing for protection. And Christine Jones is one of our leading soil scientists, worked with Gabe along with other soil scientists and Department of Ag people. Persuaded Gabe to hop over the fence to his traditional neighbour where he'd been 12 years ago and dig up some soil, which is that clod on the top. And that soil underneath is where Gabe's has moved to in that 12-year period once he shifted. You can see the aggregation, you can see the worms. And his rainfall penetration, 2 inches in 16 seconds compared to the first inch in that clod, it takes up to 2 hours. And if you put a penetrometer into those two soils, that clod would be about 1,000 PSI. If you didn't break it, I would say Gabe's would be about 200 PSI. It's just chalk and cheese through management. So we haven't got time to go into the nitty gritty, but what's going on here when you get the right ingredients, you get to this tipping point, which the microbiologists have known for a while, called quorum sensing. Quorum being a minimum critical mass, if you like, for a meeting, and sensing communication. So if you get to that critical stage of the right plant covers, the right carbons, etc., you get this extraordinary synergy and takeoff. Because the plants and the microbes are talking to each other, whether it's disease prevention or getting rhizobia bacteria to fix nodules because the nitrogen's short, those sorts of things. Soil organic carbon's the key driver. We know that for our profitability. When we generate high levels of this, this is where this self-organisation, this quorum sensing can occur, and you get very rapid soil building. So quorum sensing really, I can only devote a few slides, but it's that soil microbial community's ability to sense and respond to signals when you get to this critical soil health threshold. Signals crying out for disease prevention or for a lacking nutrient like a nitrogen or something. The vocab's obviously chemicals, and it goes across all plant and soil animal kingdoms and phylogenera species. There's thousands of metabolites at work here, allowing this sophisticated signalling network between the plants, the roots, and the microbes. And there's a range of hormones that are doing this. And so that brings me back to that definition I threw at you of regenerative agriculture. It's that complex adaptive systems view. It's those practices that enable landscapes and systems to self-organise back to health, open-ended health. In other words, to self-heal, utilising those emergent properties residing within the system. They're there because that's how it's co-evolved, and we've just suppressed them. I think it's an exciting development as we catch up with the soil biologists and the microbiologists. One of the leading scientists working in this area, Professor David Johnson, he's found that quorum sensing signal proteins, which are the regulation messengers, are 10 times higher in healthy soils than stressed ones. And they're giving these important housekeeping gene expressions: drought resistance, plant growth regulation, nutrient increases, big increases in soil carbon use efficiencies, disease prevention. That's one hell of a toolkit. to have on your side. But I pose a question, if we carry on like that, what chance quorum sensing, self-organisation and tipping points? Not much. And finally, and I haven't got much time to address this, I think it's pretty obvious, if we line up the other three landscape functions, you get remarkable regeneration of biodiversity. Whatever you want to call it, dynamic ecosystem communities, where along suddenly comes diversity, networks, complexities, mutualism, symbiosis, bacteria, etc., etc. And a lot of people in this room know this field better than me, and I won't go into it. I'll just point out one very obvious one. That's a bee covered in pollen. And we know from recent research in the cropping zones of North Europe that there's been a 70% crash in the population of insects. These little blokes are responsible for a huge amount of our food. And we know pretty certainly what's behind the crash in those insects. It's the human chemicals and the way we treat the landscape. And just some positive examples, which I think has huge potential in Australia, that some of it's evolving, but what you see in Iberia, in Spain, Portugal and other places, how we can multiply stack different functions into a landscape to increase production, which is cropping and grazing under tree or shrub systems for micronutrients and foods and the whole box and dice. And as we found out in the recent fires, things like oaks make amazing fire breaks because they're full of water in their canopy. So that, as well as being deep-rooted and dropping high protein at the right time. So there's huge potential, I think, for silvopastoral behaviour. So how do we turn things around? Coming back to the Anthropocene. Just a reminder of the role of what we have done in the last 10, 12,000 years, destabilizing, a key role in destabilizing 6 of those 9 planetary systems. I've been privileged to work with Paul Hawken, and he initially did this book, Drawdown. 70-odd scientists put their backs into it to look at the 100 top best methods of pulling down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to address climate change. When you look at the best 24, half of them are regen ag methods. So in other words, really, if you add them all up, we have some of the best tools to bring down carbon dioxide and address climate change. And if we get more soil carbon in, it's going to address 5 of those other 9 Earth systems that we've been destabilizing: biodiversity, land use, water cycles, etc., etc. And a couple of years ago, the US government commissioned Princeton University to do a net zero America study to see what it would look like. And one of their negative conclusions was from the States. Most cropland topsoils now contain less than 60% of their original carbon stocks. And it's estimated that worldwide agricultural practices have resulted in the loss of around 130 billion tonnes of carbon, which is hard to comprehend. And as an aside, that lower area of the big cropping zones of America and the Mississippi Valley, the lower area is now called Cancer Alley. It has the highest cancer rates in the world. That's a whole other issue to do with chemicals, etc., and lack of food nutrients. But there's good news that came out of this Princeton study, the Net Zero America study. Because of this enormous carbon debt, the adoption of regenerative agricultural management practices now have the capacity to rebuild much of this previous terrestrial carbon stock, and in the process, act to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. In other words, to address climate change and other linked factors. And so finally, I can only deal with this quickly, but I think it's huge and exciting. Regenerative agriculture is now addressing the alarming human health crisis. Because in reality, the Anthropocene and human ill health are actually joined at the hip. They both come from the same causal factors. Because the great acceleration, I think Will Stephan and others will touch on later, also includes the modern diseases, and it has the same exponential graphs in a delayed fashion. So post the 1980s, delayed fashion as nutrients of our food, the densities, and some of the poisons getting in accelerate this. And just all the graphs tend to have this exponential shape. Doesn't matter if it's thyroid cancer, ADHD, Alzheimer's, autism, the whole spectrum. They're all showing diseases that weren't seen in about 1910 are suddenly skyrocketing. And this is sort of half-day lecture for people who know what they're talking about, but very simply, what's the cause of the decline? We know it's the over-processing of food. We know it's genetic modification of what are complex genomics and very narrow breeding goals in plants and animals. We know the role of industrial chemicals, fertilizers that kills the soil biology and thus prevents them, like microhazal fungi and others, dragging in the nutrients and the micronutrients. In other words, most of the decline in nutrients is related to a serious decline in soil health and in soil carbon, which is leading to nutrient-poor foods. For example, we know that big industrial food, which is the largest industry in the world at about 15 trillion US, in that population, and unfortunately we're copying it, about 60% of the calories consumed there are from ultra-processed food. They've got stuff all of the critical micronutrients and nutrients and minerals that we need and which we co-evolve for our health. And look, there's dozens of papers I could wheel out. This one was done in about 2008, the modern bread, the white bread wheats. They looked at 63 wheat cultivars because the big trend had been going from the tall wheats, your federations, etc., to dwarf wheats for maximum production. So yes, grain yield went through the roof, but nutrient concentrations crashed when you compare to the early varieties 80, 90 years ago. And this is out of the UK, Europe, America, etc., a very common result. Much greater micronutrient deficiencies in a lot of our key minerals that are essential to our physiological function and those of our animals. And there's heaps of studies replicated in primary nutrients, secondary phytochemical degradation in vegetables, fruit, meat, etc., etc. So you wonder about our track of human evolution, where we're going as we strip out our nutrients. So conclusion regarding our modern foods, I would say that industrial agriculture is destroying food nutrient availability, diversity and quality while putting man-made poisons into our industrial foods and bodies, and that's both animal and human. I'll just touch briefly and get myself into further trouble, but this is the elephant in the room. I mean, it's the world's most widely used herbicide, glyphosate, Roundup. A lot of people don't think they can farm without it, although we know we can from the examples I've shown. But it's now being found to have horrific effects because it's into our food and our animals' food. So it's the world's most widely used herbicide, and the key scientists that are working in this area bravely say there are 4 key reasons why it's emerging as the worst and most pervasive chemical in our environment, because it's in our food. It's a chelator. That means it clumps minerals out of solution. Imagine that in our guts and our animals' guts. It interferes in the vital microbial Shikimadi pathway, which is the protein pathway in microbes, etc., who are the guys that rule our guts, aggregate the foods and the chemical chains and apportion it, etc. We know it's water soluble and has now been found to penetrate the gut, the blood-brain and placental barriers. We know it has major epigenetic effects. In other words, the switching on and off of genes in our gut microbiome, which is leading to huge disruptions in human and animal health. Epigenetics, as I say, it's not mutations, changes in DNA structure, it's the switching on or off, which can be heritable of different genes within the system. And for a few decades, there have been a few brave individuals ringing the bell in the States, and they've paid for it. Don Huber there has suffered a hit on his life and threatening phone calls at midnight regularly for speaking out. And he's one of the most respected soil biologists in the States. And Bob Kramer obviously doesn't work for the USDA anymore, but they've been ringing the bell for a fair while. its dangers, killing beneficial soil microbes that keep pathogens in check, binding up nutrients, that's that collation thing, making them inaccessible, rendering plants as more vulnerable to disease without defences, and its breakdown product, AMPA, being more toxic than even glyphosate, etc., etc. Professor Huber can do a 2-day seminar non-stop just on his work on glyphosate, and he's widely respected on both sides of the fence over there, and I won't go into them, but it's pretty frightening. If you look at the one, ecological disruption with bees and amphibians and stuff, and what's happening with hive disease and stuff in the States, almost certainly linked to this sort of thing. But the positive side, we now know that the new regenerative cropping practices reveal we can successfully farm without glyphosate. These guys are doing it, and they're doing it profitably and productively, whether it's natural intelligence agriculture, pasture cropping, grassland grains, multi-species covers. Animals are in those systems, and it's working, and it's profitable, and it's rebuilding the landscape functions. And so finally, and this will be quick, addressing human ill health. We need to reclaim our food systems, our urban spaces, traditional cultures, our self-sufficiency, stop this dependency on the big chains and the big manufacturers and the big chemical companies, both as consumers and farmers. And heaven's sake, we need to reconnect our children with Mother Nature, get them off those bloody devices, bottom right. We need to get them to wonder again about nature. And that photo top right, I mean, toddlers and babies need to crawl around in the dirt, ingest bacteria to develop a resilient gut microbiome. They're now being isolated in a totally sterile environment inside. So the more we get away from nature, the more problems are emerging. And we can turn things around through regreening our farms, cities, and our foods. It's happening, and it's growing, and it's pretty exciting. And so just to wrap up quickly and hopefully put some of this conference in context. As Paul Hawkins says, and I'm sure we're going to hear it from Will Stephan and others at this conference, it may even be less than that in some areas like the Northern Hemisphere oceans. We've only got one generation to turn this around, that's all. Or we could have runaway events. And as leading environmentalist Gus Speth said, today's problems can't be solved with today's mind. Or as an old farmer said to me the other day, the thinking that got us in the shit won't get us out of it. We've got to change these mindscapes if we're going to change our landscapes. And that's regenerative ag is doing that. And Donald Worcester's a well-respected environmental historian. I think he's got 3 lovely principles for good farming: making people healthier, promoting a just society, and preserving the earth and its network of life. And so I'm arguing strongly that regenerative agriculture does have solutions for what are really unique times in our species history. We know it can heal natural systems. We know it's got some key solutions to the Anthropocene crisis and key solutions to the human health crisis. It's a pretty good trifecta. And as this journalist, Brian Conant, said, Roar of the Turtle, behold the turtle, he makes progress only when he sticks his neck out. I wish our politicians could follow that. Now's the time we've got to do it. And I've just brought up these guys here. There's our unique blue-green planet on the left. It's the only one we've got. It's unique. And life, as I said, created conditions for life, but is now threatened by one species, us. And yet we stand on the shoulders of giants. There's 3 of them there. The Jesuit thinker Teilhard de Chardin, early 20th century. James Lovelock, a physicist who came up with a Gaia theory of this living one Earth and its systems. Thomas Berry, a passionist order, a thinker. And more recently now we have the planetary scientists joining them, putting a picture on this sensitive Earth with its systems. But I guess what I'm saying, if we want to see our grandchildren live their whole lives on a habitable earth with healthy lives, then it's extremely urgent that we enable our one and only blue-green planet to be able to self-organise back to health, and the landscapes therefore within it. And so I strongly argue that regenerative agri can be a pathfinder in this regeneration of our planet and ourselves. And it's what Thomas Berry, bottom right there, called our great work. And I think that that must be our most urgent task henceforth. Thank you.